morning, good afternoon, and
Good evening.
welcome to R.W.A, Radicals with Age. My name is Jesse.
And my name is Pancho.
Just this past week in Georgia, we had yet another mass shooting. It is from my notes, the 432nd mass shooting of the year, which is an 8% increase from 2021, which is the highest homicide gun rate we have on record. So, Dad, I gotta say, what do we do about gun violence in this country?
I would say that the biggest problem with gun violence is the relatively recent reinterpretation of the Second Amendment by the 2008 District of Columbia versus Heller Supreme Court decision. Prior to that, for 200 years, the Second Amendment was always interpreted as having nothing to do with individuals having guns in their homes. I actually did a little research because at one point, I was traveling around the state giving talks on the Second Amendment. And one of the things I discovered in my research is that the term bear arms has only ever been used in a military context. It was never, ever intended to be of use talking about civilians. And again, as I said, until 2008, that was the interpretation of the Second Amendment. We should look at the specific language of the Second Amendment. So my point is that, yes, gun violence is a huge problem, but it is only a symptom of the previous problem, which is the interpretation of the Second Amendment.
Then let's take a look at it, right? The text of it, which I think starts with
a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. So I want to spend a few minutes breaking down both the language and the structure of the Second Amendment.
Please.
I believe, I'm not sure if I'm correct on this, but I think I am. I believe that of all the amendments to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, this is the shortest one, number one. And number two, it is the only one that begins in the way that it does. We have an A and a B. The A essentially says, given that we need a militia in order to have a secure country, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So let's break this down. Essentially, it says, I'm going to change the language slightly, because we need a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, the first problem is we no longer need a militia.
right.
Militias are, in fact, illegal presently in the United States. So let's go back to the time that the Second Amendment was created. At that time, militias essentially functioned in the same way that volunteer fire departments did. If you are a volunteer firefighter, that is because there is no regular fire department. So at your home, you have to have your boots, your rubber coat, your hat, and your axe, so that when you hear that there's a fire, you grab your equipment, you get in your vehicle, and you drive to the fire. Once volunteer fire departments no longer exist, there is no longer a need for people to keep a hatchet in their house. So that analogy is an explanation of the language of the Second Amendment. Because we need a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, we don't need militias anymore because we have the National Guard. And as I said earlier, the phrase to keep and bear arms was only ever used in a military context. And again, for over 200 years, that is the way that that language was interpreted by the Supreme Court.
And so what happened?
And so what happened in 2008, District of Columbia versus Heller, by the slimmest of margins, 5-4, the court decided that the Second Amendment now protects a civilian's right to keep a handgun in their home for purposes of self-defense. That was never what the Second Amendment was intended to mean. It was only intended to mean, again, bear arms in a military context. So because the meaning of the Second Amendment was changed, and by the way, it was Justice Antonin Scalia who was the head person in making that new definition of the Second Amendment. Scalia said that the first part of the language was irrelevant, and that the only part that counted was the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Again, it's an A and a B. If you take away the A, then you take away the B. One of the analogies I like to use is to think about the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Let us imagine that you lived in a town of Hamelin, and occasionally there were a few rats. And so you got rid of those rats with traps or whatever. And then all of a sudden, there was a plague of rats, and people started getting overwhelmed. And so the town of Hamelin passed a law that said, even though rat poison is dangerous, we are not going to infringe on the right of people to have rat poisoning in their home because we have this plague of rats. Even though rat poison, could be mistaken for flour, kids could eat it and die, etc. Right. But because the plague was so bad, the town decided to change its view. Then along comes the Pied Piper. And the Pied Piper does his thing, and all the rats disappear. What does that do to Hamelin's law? The law said, given the plague of rats, the right of the people to keep rat poisoning shall not be infringed. Well, if the plague of rats is gone, then there's no longer any need for people to keep dangerous rat poison in their house.
Right.
This is exactly the same thing that's happening with the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Blah, blah, blah. We no longer need a well-regulated militia. We have the National Guard. For 200 years, this was interpreted as having nothing to do with individual people being able to keep guns in their home for protection.
Right.
And let's remember that as a result of that, we had the Stand Your Ground law passed in Florida, which resulted in George Zimmerman murdering Trayvon Martin. And his defense was that it was the Stand Your Ground, which goes back to the reinterpretation of the Second Amendment. Other thing I want to say about the history of the Second Amendment is, again, for 200 years, there was one interpretation. And Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, John Ashcroft, started encouraging lawyers to write articles in law review journals in which they reinterpreted the meaning of the Second Amendment to include the right of individuals to keep guns in their homes. And as a result of his pushing, lots of articles came out, and that gave the Supreme Court some legal groundwork upon which to argue that the Second Amendment did, in fact, extend to individuals having guns in their homes. Let me also say that Warren Burger, who was appointed to the Supreme Court by my favorite president, Richard Nixon, 5 years after he retired from the Supreme Court, he made a appearance on the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour in which he said, quote, "The Second Amendment has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud. I repeat the word fraud on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime."
Wow.
Warren Burger was incredibly conservative. And even he, in his retirement, said that the way that people are interpreting the Second Amendment is completely incorrect. And as you pointed out at the beginning, there have been, every year, there are more mass shootings than there are days in the year. And that has happened since the reinterpretation of the Second Amendment by the Supreme Court. And I would say the blood of all those people is on the hands of all those Supreme Court justices who voted to reinterpret the Second Amendment. We would not have the degree of gun violence that we currently have in the United States if that Supreme Court decision in 2008 had not been made.
And it's a massive discrepancy, too. I did a little bit of research before this, and you look at nearly every country in Europe, and the gun death rate per 100,000 is less than 1. It's 0.3. There's, of course, outlier countries throughout the world, but of course, Europe and the West is what you would think we would compare ourselves to, and we are much closer. 4.3 gun deaths per 100,000. It's much closer to countries like Honduras and Venezuela and Iraq. It's just so out of whack. So clearly, you're right. Not to go down a huge rabbit hole, but your mentioning of Ashcroft and getting this change to slowly happen in the lexicon of getting legal scholars to produce these opinions that slowly gave the Supreme Court this ammunition. Do you see a similarity with what's sort of happening now with Roe, that for decades after Roe was passed, you have not lawyers, but in this case, Christian activists trying to define life at conception and personhood, and therefore making the decision that we saw recently much easier for them?
No question. The whole issue of woman's right to freedom in terms of how she controls her own body is of great importance. And, it's funny that people talk about the Supreme Court should not be activist. And when there's a liberal Supreme Court, people always attack it for being activist. And when there's a Republican Supreme Court, they never say that. I mean, look at what Clarence Thomas recently did in his concurring opinion on overturning Roe v. Wade. He put in a little sentence that had nothing to do with the issue, saying that the appointment of a special prosecutor was illegal.
Right.
And Judge Cannon in Florida used that to attempt to completely throw out Jack Smith's case. That will be overturned. But the fact that we have to go through this, and we won't even mention, all the free trips that Clarence has received, and the person who gives him the free trips has cases that come up before the Supreme Court. If that's not a conflict of interest, what is? And
Right.
every other court below the Supreme Court has an ethics code that is mandatory, and the Supreme Court does not.
Yeah. You can argue that appointment to this court is one of the most important positions in the entire country, if not honestly the entire world. And that, like you just said, yeah, there's very little oversight in some of these things that happen in all the lower courts. So yeah, there's this, as well as them being appointed for life, there's this sort of immunity that they have that
We are
seems
the
really messed up.
only country in the Western world that has Supreme Court justices appointed for life. We are the only one. Why is that? Good question. And getting back to the topic of guns, a couple of years ago, after this decision had been passed, I was in Texas. And walking down the street, I can't tell you the number of signs I saw in restaurant windows and store windows saying no guns allowed. Because as a result of the Supreme Court decision, people can walk down the street carrying guns. It's like we're
Right.
back in the wild, wild west days.
Yeah. I do have another question for you too. It's something that came up and I haven't done tons of research about, but I remember hearing that one of the first big challenges to, because as we know, the NRA is pro-gun in really every circumstance possible. However, I've heard that there was one that when members of the Black Panther Party started openly carrying guns in California, all of a sudden the NRA had something to say about gun laws. Is that true? Do you remember that?
Everybody had something to say about that. Well, I mean, this is clearly a topic about race. When white folks were carrying guns, people didn't get upset. But then because the law said you could carry guns in California, the Black Panthers said, okay, we're going to walk down the street carrying guns and we are obeying the law. And then everybody got way upset because, if white folks have guns, it's okay. But if black radicals have guns, no way.
Yeah.
And of course, there was so much violence against the Black Panthers.
Right.
Let's not forget Huey Newton being put in jail. Let's not forget the assassination in the middle of the night by Fred Hampton, leader of the Panthers in Chicago. And the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, that actually we've already started to go down this rabbit hole, but there's of course the recent film about Fred Hampton, Judas and the Black Messiah, and I thought it was interesting. I'm sure that story is at least mostly true, but interesting that the focal point of that movie is his his friend betraying him and not.
I didn't like the film precisely for that reason, that it would have been great to have a film about Fred Hampton and how visionary he was for someone who was so incredibly young. He was only in his 20s.
Right.
And he was amazing and amazingly articulate about what his political vision was, which is why the FBI and the Chicago police found him to be so, to put it nicely, problematic.
Yeah.
And so they had to take him out. And that was the first week of December in 1969, which was a very momentous week, because also during that week it was the first national draft lottery.
Mm.
And it was the concert at Altamont with the Rolling Stones, where somebody was killed by the Hells Angels.
Right.
And for many people, that event at Altamont has been thought of as the end of the 60s.
Mm. And not just because of the date, but just because of course, what was happening too.
Because people tended to think of 60s as the summer of love from 1967, and everything was about peace and love.
Yeah.
And then it ended up with violence.
Mm. Well, to get us a little bit more current and back on track, we, of course, the two of us are so about optimism and solutions. What do we do? Do we stack the court? Do we, pressure Congress to throw the Second Amendment out? What do we do with this mess we have?
In order to get rid of the Second Amendment, which is what I think we should do, and what Justice Stevens argues for in his book, Six Amendments, How and Why We Should Change the Constitution.
Mm.
In order for that to happen, we would have to have a Democratic majority in both the House and the Senate. Congress could also come up with an enforceable code of ethics that Supreme Court justices would have to follow. As long as we have a divided Congress, that is never going to happen. And but I would say, we need to get rid of the Second Amendment. We need to have term limits for Supreme Court justices, and we need to have an enforceable code of ethics. To slightly go off the topic, but not really, look at Ginny Thomas.
Mm.
She has been encouraging since day one everybody who was involved in January 6th. And she claims that she and Clarence never have any conversations about this stuff over the dinner table.
Right.
And do you really think anybody on the planet believes that? And then he votes for things that are similar to the things that she is encouraging people about.
Yeah.
So, minimally, it's a major conflict of interest on his part. And that's why we need a code of ethics, because he should be forced to recuse himself. Not only that, at least other Supreme Court justices have lied in their confirmation hearings, where they said that they would not overturn Roe v. Wade because it was a 50-year-old precedent. And then as soon as they had the opportunity to do so, they did. To me, you lied to Congress when you said that.
Right.
And therefore you should be impeached.
That is all too common a theme now, that politicians in whatever form make all of these promises to the people and then get in office and not only don't honor those, but sometimes, as you just pointed out, do the exact opposite of what they said they were going to do.
And when that happens, what does that say about the nature of our country, about the nature of the judicial system? Going back to a question you asked about what we should do. Mostly what we have been talking about today is negative things going on. And I believe that it is important to remain optimistic. As you know, I am a college professor, And I would not be able to do my job unless I was in a position where I could encourage my students to believe that when they graduate from college, they have the power to go out into the world and to help make the world a better place.
Right.
If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be able to do my job. And of course, this gets to an ultimate issue, which is capitalism. Capitalism encourages you, as you said earlier, to think about me rather than we. And we need to move to a different kind of system where the purpose of government is to help people. I find it incredibly interesting that all these Republican governors, like Ron DeSantis in Florida, for example, are always screaming about how we have to limit the size of government, blah, 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 blah. But then as soon as there's a hurricane, he's on his knees begging the government to come in and help him.
Right.
But he wants to limit the size of government. That's what government is for. That's why we have things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. That was one of the great accomplishments of Franklin Roosevelt, was establishing those programs. And now we have Trump and other Republicans talking about we want to cut those things. I mean, do we really want to have a situation, which we're still having to a certain extent? People die on the street every day because they don't have health care, and the hospital won't take them in because they won't pay the enormous bills, which gets us to the other topic of the insurance industry and how they rip people off. Why do we need them in the first place? If we had a good society where things like daycare, healthcare, education were all taken care of by the government, as is the case in most European countries, their quality of life is so much better. Whenever you see a list of the countries with the happiest people in the world, the top 5 are all in Scandinavia.
Exactly.
Where they take care of all of those things for you. And yes, your taxes are higher, and therefore your take-home pay is not as much, but the quality of life, which is what people should care about, the quality of life is so much better.
Couldn't agree more. The incomes are lower too. It's not just taxes being higher. Because I have quite extensively looked into the possibility of moving overseas, first in 2016. And
who hasn't?
Right, exactly. And so you look at jobs and you see, yeah, the incomes are way less, and the taxes are going to be much higher. But like you said, so much more is guaranteed. The quality of life is so much better. So, yeah, unfortunately, even if we woke up with a magic wand tomorrow and could eliminate the Second Amendment, it doesn't mean that these root causes that, and namely, I think, economic scarcity and deprivation, which is what leads to high levels of stress and therefore cortisol and glucocorticoids in the bloodstream and in the brain, which leads to the deterioration of our brains, which then increases our propensity to violence, to being impulsive, to being less patient. All of these social factors that on a micro level maybe aren't too huge, but they happen generation after generation. It's actually something that I should mention here as well. There's this Republican dog whistle that Black Americans are the most violent, and it is technically true, which is why they're able to say it. But you need to go and look at why that's the case. And the reason is economic. Black people are way more likely to live in poverty, and poverty, again, is the greatest predictor of violence, of incarceration rates. And so
but I would also push back on that a little. When's the last time we had a mass shooting in the United States and the perpetrator was Black?
That is true.
It's almost always a white person. Look at what just happened in Georgia. I mean, it blows my mind that after somebody has done one of these things, they always manage to find information about them from the past. So in this case, a year ago, the FBI went to the house and talked to the kid and the kid's father because the kid had been putting things out on social media about committing some kind of mass shooting.
Mm,
And after that FBI interview, the father goes out and buys his 14-year-old kid a gun. And then the kid somehow gets into school with the gun and kills 2 kids and 2 teachers. And in situations like that, as also happened in the case in Michigan, parents should be held responsible.
right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's definitely, we could go on so many tangents about the justice system and how many injustices there are towards particularly Black people. I think of the Innocence Project and how many Black men in particular are on death row. And then, you know, sometimes they're fortunate enough to have money and lawyers to overturn these convictions, but so many have been executed and then found with, especially now as we have more and more DNA evidence, that it's clear that these people weren't guilty and yet they were executed by the state. So you're absolutely right. This mass shooting thing is definitely a white person, a white collar crime.
Look at the shooting that took place a couple of months ago in the supermarket in Buffalo, where this white dude drove for hours to a place he did not live, where he knew the majority of the population in that neighborhood was Black,
Right.
and he wanted to kill as many Black people as he could. Like, what is this about? Why is there so much hatred?
Mm.
Well, we know why there's so much hatred. White people are getting scared
Yeah.
because the country is becoming browner every day, and white privilege is suffering, as it should, as a result of that.
Right. And something we'll certainly continue to touch upon, but even mentions, we're going to have a whole talk about CRT and just how even mentioning, a radical or a anti-white or even just a pro not white lens on history and culture is all of a sudden dangerous to this shrinking white populace.
And I have another little thing. One of my pet peeves about violence is the death penalty.
Mm.
So somebody kills somebody. That's illegal. If it's illegal for that person, they're robbing a store and they kill the person behind the counter. If it's illegal for them to do that, then why is it legal for the state to then kill the person? If killing is wrong, killing is wrong.
Agreed.
And it shouldn't be okay for the state to kill people. Not to mention the fact that they screw it up so often.
Yeah.
With the kinds of drugs they use.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think about is if we're going to have the death penalty, it should be, what are these weird conversations to try and make it slightly more ethical? You're still killing the person. Who cares what kind of cocktail it is? And as you've touched on, sometimes it's even more horrific than, hanging someone. And I think we just have moved away from that because it's gruesome. People want to be separated from the violence. They don't want to know that they were the person that injected that chemical, or they're the one when they used to do. And I think they're actually bringing it back in some states of firing lines. When they do a firing line, there's always a number of people who have blanks. So you never actually know who did the physical killing. But
Correct.
I
Correct.
think all of these things are just ways to shy away from how barbaric it is in the first place and how it should absolutely be obsolete at this point.
And that also reminds me of what happened on January the 6th
Mm.
and the fact that so many of the people who were involved were people in the military and people in the police who are trained to perpetuate violence against people.
Right.
We are
Yeah.
teaching people to be violent, and then we're surprised when they act violently.
Right. And I think I'd have to do some deeper research, but I think that's a phenomenon that has been identified in mass shooters too, that there's often a police, law enforcement, military sort of background. I mean, that's already a high likelihood if you're a gun owner that you have some connection to that. But yeah, I think that there's a pretty statistically significant percentage of these folks that either were ex-military themselves or have parents or uncles that were either in the military or the police. So like you said, we are actively training people to behave this way.
And this, circles us back to the beginning in talking about Second Amendment. People didn't used to be able to have personal weapons in their house. If you want to hunt, you can go and hunt. If you like to shoot, you can become a member of the shooting range, and you go to the shooting range and your gun is locked up and you shoot while you're at the shooting range, and then your gun is locked up and you go home. And there's so much needless violence taking place precisely because people are now allowed to have guns in their homes.
Yeah.
And domestic violence.
Right. Yeah. But even if we get rid of all of the guns, we still have these systems that have to be changed and replaced because we're still going to have people who have high rates of mental illness, who are prone to violence. So yeah, getting rid of the Second Amendment is a great start. But as I know you share with me, these greater systems, particularly our economic system of market capitalism, that perpetuates these ideas of competitive advantage, of inequality, of greed, of, like you said, me versus we. It's all of that stuff does so much to our, group psychology. And without doing that, we're only going to make small strides.
Exactly. Which is why the upcoming election is so important. People need to stand up. And I was very impressed at both Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney for coming out this weekend saying that they were both going to vote for Kamala Harris, which is pretty amazing when you think about Republicans, you think about Dick Cheney.
Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine Dick Cheney or Liz Cheney, whose views on everything I find disgusting. Nevertheless, the fact that both of them are coming out and saying that they're voting for Kamala Harris, it's one thing to say, I don't support Trump. It's a much bigger step to say, and in fact, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris.
Right. Yeah. And I won't take us down a rabbit hole about Dick Cheney and guns, but we know the hypocrisy there.
Yeah, well, he shot somebody.
Exactly. One of his friends.
One of his friends.
Well, I think it's come to be that time. I hope those of you who have joined us have learned a thing or two. In the words of certainly my hero, and I think my dad's hero as well, Malcolm X, I will never say that progress is being made. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there is no progress. The progress is healing the wound that's below, that the blow made. And they haven't even begun to pull the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there. And our song of the week is Guns Are Drawn by The Roots. For Jesse and Pancho, thank you for joining us on Radicals with Age, and we will see you after a while.